Imagine this: a man who used to smirk every time she counted coins at the cafe register is now the one adjusting his tie, fumbling for words as she walks into the boardroom, not as his assistant, but as his superior. He never expected to see her again, and certainly not like this. Lena used to serve lattes with shaky hands and eyes too soft for the world. She worked double shifts, wore shoes with paper-thin soles, and never once complained when customers like him barked for extra foam as if she were invisible. But what burned more than the 12-hour shifts and aching feet was how he'd look at her. Daniel's silver watch, tailored blazer, and a voice that rang like a gavel in a courtroom. He never said much, but when he did, it was always something that cut her down just enough to feel small without bleeding. "Must be hard, huh? Making rent on tips," he once said, sipping the latte she handed him. She'd smiled. That soft, trained smile. The kind of smile women are taught to wear like armor. But inside, something twisted slowly, silently, like roots cracking through concrete. You don't forget that kind of look. The kind where someone scans you like a spreadsheet and files you under not worth it. Years passed, and people forget faces like hers, not flashy, not loud, just ordinary enough to blend in. But they always remember women like Lena when it's too late. When the balance of power flips and the person they underestimated now holds the pen that signs their fate. She walked into that boardroom on a Tuesday. There was nothing theatrical about her. No grand entrance, no designer heels clicking like drum rolls. Just her in a fitted black dress, a quiet presence, eyes that didn't dart anymore, and a calmness that unnerved. He didn't recognize her at first. How could he? The Lena he knew never held eye contact this long, never sat at the head of a table surrounded by decision-makers. But when she spoke only one sentence, everything in him crumbled. "I trust you remember me, Mr. Rains," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, not angry, not bitter, worse, unaffected. And that's the part that cuts deepest for men like him. He blinked. It took a full 5 seconds for his brain to catch up to the moment. Because when you spend your life stepping on people, you never expect one to rise so tall that you have to look up. You see, power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers through restraint. It hums in a woman's silence when she could humiliate but chooses not to. That's what haunts the ego. She didn't need to say more. She didn't need to pull out receipts or recount the exact number of times he dismissed her humanity for sport. Her presence was the receipt. Her success was the punctuation. And you watching this unfold might wonder how she did it. How she went from scraping coins for rent to sitting across from the man who once sneered at her like she was furniture. But here's the truth. Some women stay silent until they can speak from the mountaintop. She didn't just climb the ladder, she rebuilt the entire structure. Studied late, worked harder, cried into pillows where no one could hear, and built armor from every slight, every belittlement, every whisper behind her back. Lena learned something in that cafe. That being underestimated is a currency of its own if you learn to invest it. And Daniel, he was just another man who never learned the golden rule of underestimation. One day the girl you pitied might be the one who decides if you stay or go. Daniel sat motionless like a man caught between past sins and present consequences. The corners of his mouth twitched, not a smile, not quite regret, but something hollow, brittle. His hands were clasped too tightly on the table, knuckles drained of color. He couldn't look at her directly. His eyes darted to the wall, the water bottle, the conference phone, anywhere but her. Lena, meanwhile, flipped through the proposal packet he had presented earlier, her fingers deliberate nails, short and neat, not a single wasted movement. This wasn't about revenge. It was about showing him that she remembered even when he didn't. That was always the pattern, wasn't it? Men like Daniel forget. They forget the faces, they humiliate the women, they sideline the girls, they embarrass for sport. Because to them, the cruelty was casual. But to Lena, to women like Lena, those moments become tattooed into bone. He remembered now, of course. It was impossible not to. The flashbacks hit him like flashes of lightning, her hair tucked behind her ear as she apologized for mixing up orders, the faint redness in her eyes during a particularly long shift, her silence when he'd chuckle and say, "Don't worry, you're not management material." Not management material. And yet here she was, vice president of strategy, presiding over the very table he once ruled. She tapped her pen against the folder. "I've reviewed the numbers. They're adequate, but I'm not sure the leadership vision is aligned with where we need to go." It was business speak, clinical calm, but each word was a scalpel. Daniel cleared his throat, found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "Lena, I didn't realize you were with Polaris now. That old fake warmth. That same tight-lipped smile he used when trying to charm board members. She didn't return it. She didn't need to. "I've been here 3 years," she said flatly. "Started as an analyst, worked my way up. The very words he once mocked. You might think she wanted to rub it in, that she savored this moment finally above the man who once looked down on her like she was dirt beneath his shoes. But Lena had already let go of needing to prove anything. That version of her, the girl who wanted him to see her worth, was gone. What remained was a woman sculpted by every dismissal, every eye roll, every smirk she'd swallowed in silence. And if you're reading this thinking, I would have said something, I would have confronted him, ask yourself, how many times have you dimmed your own light just to survive a room? How many times have you accepted crumbs because someone made you believe that was all you deserved? You don't understand the storm Lena carried in her silence until you've lived it. Daniel was fidgeting now. "Look, if I said anything back then that came off the wrong way." She held up a hand. "You don't need to explain." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't soften. It just was. "This isn't personal." But they both knew it was. Not in the way he feared. She wasn't plotting revenge. She wasn't going to sabotage his project or call out his hypocrisy in front of the others. No, her presence alone was punishment enough. Because there's nothing more unnerving than being confronted by someone you once treated as irrelevant, only to realize they remember everything and you remember nothing. The meeting continued. She asked hard questions, pulled data holes apart, suggested alternatives. Not once did she raise her voice or act vindictive. She was composed, professional, brutally clear-eyed, and that scared him more than any outburst ever could. Because deep down Daniel knew he was now playing a game where the rules had changed, where charm and status weren't enough, where the person he once belittled had become the gatekeeper to his next contract. After the others filed out, leaving behind the scent of coffee and tension, Lena lingered. She gathered her notes, closed the folder, and stood. Just before walking past him, she paused. Her eyes locked onto his. "It's not always the loud ones you should worry about," she said softly. "Sometimes it's the quiet ones you never noticed." Then she walked away, her heels echoing across the polished floor like punctuation marks in a story she no longer needed him to read. The silence Daniel sat in afterward was thick, unbreathable. He stayed at the table long after everyone else had gone, his hands now loose at his sides, helpless. The hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, like the faint buzzing inside his head. He felt something he hadn't felt in years small. And isn't that ironic? How quickly the roles reverse when the mirror flips. The same man who once smirked at her threadbare coat and cashier apron now couldn't even meet her gaze without flinching. But this story didn't begin in the boardroom. It began much earlier in a one-bedroom apartment with thin walls and a single flickering ceiling light. Back then, Lena was not yet forged, just a girl trying to keep her mother from falling apart. Her mother was a quiet shadow of a woman worn down by years of being told she was too much and then not enough. Lena grew up learning that love sometimes came in sharp words and long silences, that safety could vanish if the wrong thing was said, that survival meant becoming invisible. So when she met Daniel, charming, crisp, polished, she thought maybe this was the kind of man who would finally see her, appreciate her quiet, respect her effort. She was wrong. What he saw was something to mock gently like a hobby. He flirted just enough to keep her hoping, but always with the edge of condescension. "You've got a good heart," he'd say with a smirk. "But this place will chew you up. Don't get ideas above your station." He said it like a joke. But cruelty, when dressed as humor, cuts even deeper. And Lena learned to laugh at herself to make others comfortable, to nod, to internalize. But that one day when she found herself counting change for lunch while Daniel bragged about a ski trip, something cracked. She never told anyone, not her mother, not her co-workers. But she made a promise to herself that night she would never let anyone speak to her that way again. Not because she would fight them, but because she would make herself so unshakably formidable no one would dare. You see, some women don't scream to be seen. They disappear to become untouchable. And that's what she did. She took night classes. She listened more than she spoke. She studied what made people like Daniel win, and then she built better strategies. Slowly, methodically, quietly. No shortcuts, no connections, just grit. And it's funny how the world bends when you stop begging for it to love you. When Lena walked into Polaris Corporation as a junior analyst, no one expected much. But she was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Always watching, always learning. By the time the promotion list came out, she was already working 2 levels ahead of her title. She didn't ask to be seen. She made herself impossible to ignore. And still Daniel hadn't seen her coming. Now he would never forget. You sitting with this story in your hands might be tempted to pity him. Maybe you think he didn't know better, that he was just a product of his environment, of his privilege. But remember this, people may not remember what they said to you, but they meant it when they said it. People like Daniel only apologize when they lose access, not when they gain awareness. That's why Lena never wanted an apology. She didn't want to hear, "I'm sorry." She wanted him to understand. And on that Tuesday, in that boardroom, for the first time in his life, he finally did. Because power doesn't look like shouting. It doesn't look like slamming fists or storming out. Sometimes power is a woman leaning back in her chair, watching a man squirm in the seat he once thought she'd never occupy. And that image, it stays, it haunts. Because deep down, every man who's ever looked down on someone knows exactly what it means when the tables turn and the person they once dismissed is the one holding the future in her quiet, steady hands. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office earlier than usual. He hadn't slept much, tossing in linen sheets that once felt like success. But now they were suffocating. Every corner of his luxury apartment echoed a hollow truth. He'd built a life that looked good on paper, but felt like glass, sharp and fragile. He looked at himself in the mirror. The same expensive haircut, the same crisp shirt, but something in his face had changed. There was a shadow behind his eyes now. Not guilt, no, he was too conditioned for that. It was fear, not of Lena, but of what she represented. A reckoning. He had lived off borrowed confidence for too long, coasting through rooms padded by privilege and polished arrogance. And now he was in a space where those currencies held no weight. Because Lena wasn't just the woman he once mocked. She had become a symbol not just of his downfall, but of every silent woman he'd ever brushed past. That day at Polaris was heavy. He tried to focus, typed meaningless words into his laptop, made eye contact in meetings. But every time Lena's name came up, his jaw tensed just slightly. And she noticed. She always noticed. Lena, meanwhile, hadn't given him more than a passing thought since the meeting. Not because she wasn't aware, of course she was, but because she no longer centered men like Daniel in her emotional architecture. Her energy was precious now. It was reserved for the interns who reminded her of herself, unsure, overly apologetic, too scared to take up space. She noticed them. The girls who lowered their eyes in meetings, who qualified every sentence with just and sorry. She took them aside gently and told them the truth. No one ever told her. You're allowed to exist without permission. She built quiet alliances, taught through example, not the loud performative mentorship that earned LinkedIn praise, but the real kind, the kind that changes lives without announcements. And word spread. Lena had become the woman other women whispered about with reverence, with hope. She used to be one of us, they'd say. And look at her now. But with that reverence came rumors too. Some called her cold, detached, calculating. It didn't matter. Because every woman who dares to rise without begging earns those labels eventually. That's how the world punishes women who stop playing small. What they didn't see, what Daniel still didn't see, was how much she'd bled to become unbreakable. How many nights she'd cried in silence, how many times she wanted to give up, how often she questioned her own worth. But pain can be fuel if you learn how to hold it. And Lena, she had mastered the art of holding fire without letting it consume her. That Thursday, she was asked to lead the quarterly strategy review. The entire executive team was present, investors too. And yes, Daniel. He stood in the corner, arms crossed, eyes heavy with unspoken tension. He wasn't leading today. He was observing. The irony stung. Lena walked in last, not because she needed the attention, but because timing when mastered is power. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't project. She simply began, and the room leaned in. Slide after slide, she dismantled assumptions, reconstructed visions, and painted a future no one else had dared articulate. Not once did she raise her voice. Not once did she falter. Her confidence wasn't loud, it was anchored. And you, if you'd been there, would have felt it too. That shift, that crackling energy that happens when someone finally steps into their full self without apology. By the end of the meeting, the applause was immediate. Not theatrical, just deeply earned. Someone turned to Daniel and whispered, "She's sharp. Has she always been this good?" He didn't answer. Because what could he say? That he'd known her when she wiped tables, that he'd laughed at her dreams. No, there were no words left that wouldn't betray him. After the meeting, Lena walked past him without hesitation. Not cold, not rude, just free. And that was the dagger. Because it wasn't hatred he saw in her anymore. It was indifference. And there's no worse punishment for a man who once believed he was the center of your world than becoming invisible in the one you've built without him. It was the indifference that unraveled him. Daniel had always known how to navigate anger. It gave him control. He could redirect it, gaslight it, diminish it into something irrational. But indifference, that was unfamiliar terrain. It left no room for ego, no leverage to reclaim his superiority. It was like being erased. The truth is, Daniel had lived his life as the protagonist. He was the man people listened to, the one who entered rooms expecting the world to adjust around him. Even when he failed, and he had many times, someone always cushioned the fall. Not this time. Lena didn't give him that. She didn't give him anything. No glare, no confrontation, not even a hint that she remembered the weight of his insults. But of course she did. Every woman remembers. And you, yes you, who have ever shrunk yourself in the presence of someone like him, you understand. You remember the sting of being mocked gently in public, of being the butt of a joke you never volunteered for. You remember how your voice would tremble while theirs boomed with entitlement. You remember, because women are taught to internalize humiliation, to dress it up as humility, to absorb it and keep smiling. But Lena had done something extraordinary. She had rewired that memory, turned it from a wound into steel. And now Daniel was the one left holding shame without a name, while she thrived without needing his recognition. Later that week, Daniel tried to reach her. Not officially, not through HR or performance review channels. That would be too transparent. Instead, he waited in the executive lounge, an accidental meeting staged with surgical precision. Lena, he said when she walked in, not rising from his seat. She paused, glanced at him once, then turned to pour herself coffee. No urgency in her movements, no tension in her shoulders. When she finally sat across from him, uninvited yet unbothered, there was a pause so thick you could hear the hum of the fridge in the corner. "I wanted to talk," he started. She didn't stop him, because silence in this context was power. "I've been thinking about that time, years ago." At the cafe, he continued the words, slow, cautious. "I realize now that I may have treated you in a way that wasn't fair." There it was, not an apology, a performance of remorse. Lena sipped her coffee, then met his eyes. "I don't need fairness from you, Daniel," she said. "You were never a part of my justice." That hit him harder than if she'd raised her voice. "I just wanted to say I respect you now," he added, as if that might soften the blow. "You've come a long way." She smiled then. Not a kind smile, a knowing one. The kind of smile that says, "I see through you and I'm still not moved." "You think this started with you," she said quietly, "that you were the mountain I had to climb, but you were just one of many, a pebble, Daniel, not the summit." He blinked, because deep down his ego still wanted to believe he was a pivotal character in her story, that he'd created the fire that forged her. But Lena had long since claimed her narrative, and it didn't revolve around him. She stood gathering her things. "For what it's worth," she said, pausing at the door, "I don't hate you. I just stopped needing anything from you." And that was the real sentence. Because when someone stops needing your recognition, your approval, your memory of who they once were, they become untouchable. And he knew then what she knew all along: his respect came too late. His words were weightless now. And Lena had already risen. Not just in title, not just in salary, but in the quiet, private realm where true power lives, the part of the soul that no longer bends to old hierarchies. Daniel watched her leave. He wouldn't try again. He knew better now. Because you cannot reason with the storm once it's passed. You cannot rewrite the history someone has already used to build their empire. And Lena, she had built hers brick by brick, not out of revenge, but out of refusal. Refusal to remain unseen, refusal to keep explaining her worth, refusal to ever again let someone small define the size of her spirit. Weeks passed. Daniel stayed for a while. His team noticed the shift. He was quieter, more calculated almost, subdued. The bravado that once filled every room he entered had shriveled, replaced by awkward hesitations and forced professionalism. He no longer interrupted. He no longer led meetings with the same blind confidence. But Lena didn't watch him fall. She didn't hover. She had no interest in his unraveling. Because women like her, once they rise, don't linger in the shadows of fallen men. She was too busy building something bigger. She had started mentoring young professionals, not as a public gesture, but as a private rebellion against everything that once made her small. The interns, the new hires, the overlooked, they gravitated to her like moths to a flame, not because she demanded attention, but because she radiated a quiet safety, a presence that said, "You don't need to prove yourself to me. I already see you." One afternoon during a roundtable on leadership, someone asked Lena how she defined power. She paused for a moment, tapping her fingers lightly on the table, her eyes distant but focused. Then she said, "Power is knowing you can destroy someone and choosing not to." The room fell still. No one asked her to elaborate, because they felt it. Every word wrapped in restraint, every syllable steeped in experience. And somewhere in another department, Daniel heard about the roundtable, heard what she'd said. He didn't attend. He didn't need to. Those words weren't meant for him, and yet they pierced deeper than any direct attack ever could. He handed in his resignation quietly 2 weeks later. No dramatic exit, no farewell emails, just silence. Lena received the news with a nod. No celebration, no satisfaction, just a subtle shift in the air like a door closing softly. You might expect fireworks, some grand finale, but that's not how healing works. Because healing isn't loud. It's in the moment you stop fantasizing about revenge. It's in the morning you wake up and realize the people who once hurt you no longer live rent-free in your mind. It's in the decision to pour your energy into growth, not grudges. And Lena, she wasn't healed because he left. She had already healed when his presence stopped mattering. Months later, she sat alone at her favorite cafe, the very one where she once served cappuccinos for minimum wage and fake smiles. The new barista didn't recognize her, and that was the point. She sipped her drink, eyes scanning the window light, catching the rim of her glasses. She wasn't thinking about Daniel, or the past, or even the rise. She was thinking about how far she'd come without ever screaming for attention. Because some women don't burn bridges. They rise so high the bridges become irrelevant. And you who followed this story, who may have felt every dig, every dismissal, every moment of smallness, hear this. You don't need to perform your pain to be taken seriously. You don't need to avenge every insult. Sometimes the greatest revenge is no longer being available for the drama you outgrew. And Lena had outgrown them all. She paid her bills, stood up, and walked out without looking back. No need for applause. No need to be seen. Because the woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.